Have you ever paused to consider the reality of life for young nuns within the walls of convents? What measures did these women employ to suppress their desires? These were often places where women were involuntarily confined, subjected to stringent regulations, grueling labor, and severe punishments for even the slightest transgression. Dark and scandalous secrets, such as nuns engaging in clandestine relationships with priests, were fiercely guarded and concealed at all costs. Ironically, those entrusted with the responsibility of safeguarding these women sometimes became their exploiters. Meanwhile, the Church systematically suppressed these scandals, ensuring that no whisper of the truth ever escaped the confines of the convent walls. But today we are going to expose the truth that has been concealed for centuries. What you are about to discover may fundamentally alter your perception of religious life during the Middle Ages. Many people naively believe that these institutions were havens of peace, prayer, and spiritual refuge. However, the seldom told truth is that these locations also served as stages for immense suffering, brutal oppression, and practices that directly contradicted the very principles they espoused. Young women stripped of their choices, subjected to severe punishments, and enduring concealed abuses. All of this transpired far from the prying eyes of society. In this video, you will confront the harsh reality faced by these women and understand why so many of them yearned to escape, even if it meant risking capture and being branded as criminals. Were convents truly a path to divine enlightenment, or were they simply prisons disguised as sanctuaries? Stay with me until the end, because what you are about to uncover may irrevocably change your perspective on the Church's past. Before we begin, please share in the comments section where you are watching this video from. I'm eager to know who is joining me on this journey. Now, let's delve into this shadowy history. Believe me, what you're about to hear is truly shocking. Imagine, if you will, that you are a young woman living in the Middle Ages. For reasons entirely beyond your control, your family has decided that you must be sent to a convent. Do you have any say in the matter? In the vast majority of cases, the answer is a resounding no. Many individuals romanticize the notion that religious life was a divine calling, something that each nun freely and willingly chose. However, the stark reality is that for the majority of these women, entering a convent was not a personal decision. It was an imposition forced upon them by their families and by the prevailing societal norms. During the Middle Ages, the options available to women were severely limited. If a woman belonged to a noble family, her destiny almost always involved an arranged marriage designed to solidify political alliances and secure the family's standing. But what if the family lacked the financial resources to provide a dowry? Or what if the young woman was an illegitimate child, or worse, considered to be stubborn, rebellious, or simply inconvenient by the standards of the time? In such cases, the convent became the perfect solution, a convenient place where these unwanted women could be disposed of under the guise of dedicating themselves to God. To the outside world, their families appeared to be ensuring the salvation of their souls. However, within the walls of the convent, the reality was drastically different. Many young girls were sent into religious life while still children, without even grasping the full implications of what it meant. At the tender age of 7 or 8, they were handed over to the care of the nuns to be educated and molded for their future vows. When they reached adolescence, they were expected to decide, or more accurately, pretend to decide, whether or not to accept the habit. However, refusal was not a genuine option. How could they say no when their family had already predetermined their fate? How could they defy expectations when their refusal could result in shame or even severe punishment? And so, thousands upon thousands of women spent their lives confined, within convent walls, never experiencing the freedom to make their own choices. The convent walls were tall and imposing, the gates heavy and forbidding, and the rules were rigidly enforced. To the outside world, these women were there out of devotion and love for God. But for many of them, it was a prison, a place where they had been cast without having committed any crime. The discipline within the convents was severe, silence was strictly enforced, and contact with the outside world was virtually non-existent. Many women never saw their families again after entering the convent, whether they wept or regretted. Their situation mattered little. Their lives had already been decided. After all, an unmarried woman was often viewed as a problem. In the convent, at least, she wouldn't shame her family or cause trouble for society. But what happened within those walls? Were these women truly treated as servants of God, or were they merely instruments used to maintain a facade of sanctity? What transpired within the convents went far beyond prayer and faith. In the next chapter, you will discover the daily routines of these nuns, and be prepared because the truth may be far more cruel than you can imagine. Comment below, God is greater, to show the enemy that we have much more strength than him. Now that these women were locked away inside the convent, what became of them? Did they spend their days in contemplation and prayer? Or did they live a life of extreme sacrifice, brutal impositions, and exhausting labor? My brother, my sister, the truth is far more cruel than many imagine. Life inside the convent was not a spiritual refuge for many. It was a battleground of oppression, where their bodies and minds were tested to the breaking point. The day began before the sun even rose. Around 4 a.m., all the nuns were required to leave their cold beds in absolute silence for the first prayer of the day. But do not think that these were merely moments of peace and reflection. It was an obligation, rigorously enforced. After the morning prayer came the work, and that is when life inside the convent truly became a prison. Nuns were forced to work exhaustively, often without adequate rest. They washed clothes, cooked meals, sewed garments, cared for the sick, and kept the convent clean. For many, this routine was even worse than that of a common serf because there was no reward, no salary, only total submission. And what was even more infuriating, while they were sacrificing themselves, the leaders of the church lived in comfort. Bishops, priests, and even monks benefited from the labor of these women, who were often treated like servants with no rights. Food was rationed, just enough to keep them alive. Rest was practically non-existent. Any complaint was punished severely, but it was not enough to control their bodies. The church also dominated their minds. These women were told that their suffering was a form of purification, that each drop of sweat and each sleepless night brought them closer to God. But think about it. Since when does God want someone to live like a slave, without love, without joy, without hope? The church used fear as a weapon. They were taught to fear divine punishment if they dared to question their reality. They believed that if they disobeyed or felt any desire for freedom, they would be sinning. And so many spent their entire lives without ever knowing another world beyond those walls, dreaming of freedom, but not even allowing themselves to desire it. Now, consider this. If someone dared to rebel, what happened to her? In the next chapter, you will discover how cruel the punishments within the convent were and how many abuses were committed in the name of faith. And before we continue, tell me in the comments, what is the next Bible story you want to watch here on the channel? What secret or mystery do you want us to investigate? My brother, my sister, what I'm about to tell you is painful, but it needs to be said. Up until now, you have seen how many women were forced to enter religious life and how their routines inside the convent were marked by exhausting labor and oppression. But there was something even worse hidden behind the high walls of these institutions. The convents, which should have been places of purity and protection, often became scenes of horrors that no one dared to expose. Because within those walls, abuses took place that destroyed lives, and those who should have protected these women were actually their tormentors. The forced silence and the constant fear. Imagine being trapped in a place where you have no voice, where your pain is ignored, and any attempt to resist can result in severe punishments. This was the fate of many nuns who suffered abuse within the convents. Historical accounts show that priests and even bishops used their position to exploit these vulnerable women. How could they defend themselves? They had nowhere to run. If they denounced the abuse, who would believe them? The church was powerful, and its word was worth more than that of any nun. Many were silenced by fear, some were threatened, others were punished cruelly, and some simply disappeared. The sin was not the abuse itself. The sin, according to those in command, was trying to expose it. Hidden pregnancies and buried sins. And what happened when a nun became pregnant? The truth is grim. To avoid scandals, many of these women were forced to have abortions in secret, not because they wanted to, but because they were forced to. There are historical records of convents where the bodies of babies were found buried, silent evidence of a system that preferred to hide its crimes rather than face the truth. The irony of it all is that these same institutions preached chastity, purity, and holiness, but behind the curtains, they hid secrets that went against everything they claimed to represent. The accounts of those who dared to speak out, some ex-nuns, after managing to escape this system, recounted the horrors they lived through. Their stories were recorded in ancient documents and more recently in books and modern research. Many of them described how they were treated as objects, used and discarded without any compassion. Worst of all, very few had the chance to see justice being done. The church tried to erase these accounts, tried to silence these voices. But the truth, my brother and my sister, always finds a way to come to light. And now I ask you, does this shock you? Did you imagine that things like this happened in medieval convents? I want to know your opinion in the comments. In the next chapter, we will talk about one of the biggest taboos of religious life, forbidden desire and the hypocrisy of chastity. You will see how many nuns struggled against natural feelings and how they were punished just for being human. Forbidden desire, the hypocrisy of chastity. My brother, my sister, up until now, we have seen the suffering, the oppression, and the silent abuses that many women faced inside the convents. But now, let's talk about one of the biggest taboos of religious life, forbidden desire. The church demanded that nuns be pure, chaste, without ever even thinking about any kind of loving or carnal relationship. But the truth that many hide too, this day, is that human nature cannot simply be erased with vows and rules. And when these women were discovered feeling something that went against the norms of the convent, do you know what happened? They were punished, humiliated, and in some cases simply disappeared. Meanwhile, the men who broke these same rules almost always went unpunished, the weight of guilt and repression. From the moment they entered the convent, the nuns were taught that any desire was a sin, that their human desires should be crushed, and that their bodies were only instruments for servitude to God. But my brother, my sister, I ask you, is it possible to completely erase something that is part of human nature itself? Many nuns struggled against these feelings. They were raised to believe that even a thought could condemn them to hell. Some self-flagellated, trying to punish their own bodies to purify the soul. Others tried to confess, seeking forgiveness only to discover that confession would not save them from punishment. And worst of all, some had no choice. They were forced into relationships they never desired, and yet carried the guilt imposed by a system that saw no sin in the abuse of the powerful, but saw sin in a woman who felt any desire. When a nun was discovered, if a nun was caught breaking the vows of chastity, the consequences were brutal. Some were severely punished physically, confined to dark cells for days, even weeks. Others were forced into even heavier labor as a form of divine punishment. There were cases in which they were expelled from the convent, thrown into the street, without a place to go, without family, without anything, condemned to misery. And in the worst cases, they simply disappeared. The most outrageous thing, the men who broke the same vows rarely suffered any consequences. Priests and bishops who had relationships with nuns were only transferred to other parishes, while the woman was severely punished. The man continued to exercise his authority within the church as if nothing had happened. The hypocrisy was evident, but who would dare to question it? The secret that many took to the grave. For fear of punishment and shame, many nuns who became pregnant hid their pregnancies until the last moment. Some were forced into secret abortions. Others gave birth in secret and saw their children being taken away without ever knowing what happened to them. There are historical records of convents where the bones of newborns were found buried, silent marks of a system that preferred to bury its sins rather than admit the truth. Now, my brother, my sister, I ask you, what kind of justice was that? How could something like that be considered God's will? The history of these women was forgotten, erased by those who controlled the power. But today, we are bringing this truth to light, and I want to know from you what shocks you the most in this story. Did you imagine that things like this happened inside the convents? Comment here below. I want to read your opinion. In the next chapter, we will talk about the hidden scandals that the church tried to hide for centuries, cases that, when they came to light, shook the world. The hidden scandals, cases that shocked history. My brother, my sister, until now we have talked about the oppression, the abuses, and the hypocrisies that happened inside the medieval convents. But now we are going to reveal something even more shocking, the scandals that the church tried to hide at all costs. Because throughout history, there have been convents that ceased to be temples of devotion and became true centers of corruption and depravity. And the worst thing is, when these secrets came to light, the church's response was always the same: silence. The powerful did everything to stifle the scandals. They transferred culprits, erased records, and eliminated any threat to their reputation. Today we are going to talk about one of the most shocking cases in history, the scandal of the convent of San Ambrosio, where the abbess herself manipulated and abused the nuns while maintaining secret relations with priests. The convent of San Ambrosio, a house of horrors. This convent, located in 19th century Italy, became one of the biggest scandals of the Catholic Church. What should have been a place of holiness was actually an environment of terror and depravity. The abbess, the woman responsible for commanding the convent, not only manipulated the young women, but also abused them physically and psychologically. They said that she possessed a divine gift, that she was chosen by God. But in reality, she used this discourse to exert absolute control over those under her command. Many nuns were poisoned under the orders of the abbess. Others were forced to maintain secret relations with priests and swear silence about everything that happened there. And do you know how all this was discovered? Thanks to the testimony of a young nun who managed to escape and denounce the horrors she lived through inside the convent. When the truth began to emerge, the church tried to contain the scandal. The ecclesiastical leaders sought to minimize the accounts, discredit witnesses, and prevent the public from knowing the extent of the crimes committed there. But this time, they failed. The case went to trial, and the investigations revealed the truth about the abuses, the poisonings, and the hypocrisy that dominated that convent. The abbess and others involved were convicted, but the real punishment never came for those who covered it all up for so long. And this, my brother, my sister, is just one of the many cases that history has tried to erase. Over the centuries, several convents have been investigated for similar crimes. Old records show convents where nuns were held against their will, where there was sexual exploitation and where pregnancy scandals were hidden with forced abortions. And when this was discovered, the church always used the same strategy. They stifled the case, destroyed evidence, and removed those involved without any real punishment. After all, the image of the institution was more important than justice for the victims. Now I ask you, does this surprise you? Did you imagine that such dark things happened inside convents? I want you to tell me in the comments what shocked you the most in this story. In the next chapter, we will reveal the truth that the church tried to hide for centuries. We will talk about how this reality was erased from history and why so many people still believe that life in convents was only holiness and devotion. If there is something that this story teaches us, it is that we should not accept official versions without questioning, because those who have power will always try to hide their sins. They will always try to rewrite the facts in their favor. And the big question that remains is, how many other truths are still hidden? How many stories will we never see because they were erased before anyone could reveal them? Now, I want to know your opinion. What shocked you the most in this story? Did you imagine that life in convents could be like this? Tell me in the comments. If you have reached this point, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. And share this video because the truth needs to be known.